Hello everyone, this is Mr. Simone. I just wanted to give you a brief video to watch as we get ready for a couple days on Reconstruction following our lessons on the Civil War. Okay, so this is, by the way, one of the books by the Columbia professor Eric Foner, who is I would argue, the leading historian on the Reconstruction time period. So Reconstruction is the time following the Civil War when the U.S. was faced with many different questions of importance. So first of all, how are we going to rebuild the South following all the destruction from the Civil War? Next, we have 11 states that have, by their accounts, left or seceded from the Union. So how are we going to develop a process to readmit them back into the country? Third, slavery will be abolished eventually, so how will the 4 million newly freed African Americans be treated in a society? And then fourth, with all of these questions, who should really be in charge of the Reconstruction policies? Do you think it should be guided by the executive branch, the president, either Abraham Lincoln or Andrew Johnson, or should this be dealt with from the legislative branch and Congress? So the first big question is the debate over the president's plan and Congress's plan. So as I said, the president will be Lincoln until he's assassinated, and then it'll be followed by his vice president, Andrew Johnson. As I told you in class, Lincoln was a Republican and Andrew Johnson was a Democrat from Tennessee. He's the only Southern senator from a Confederate state who did not support secession. They both wanted to be very lenient toward the Confederate states. They wanted to make this process as easy as possible. So one of the components of their plan was for 10% of the population in the state to take an oath of loyalty to the country. And once you did that, along with the amendment to abolish slavery, those states could come back into the Union. In addition, they wanted to pardon these former Confederate leaders, not the absolute top members of the Confederacy, but maybe 13,000 other Confederate leaders were given pardons from Andrew Johnson. So they really both believed that the Southern states never really left the Union. They both felt as if secession wasn't even a legal process. Now, in Congress, there are two men, Charles Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens, who had a much different viewpoint. You might remember Charles Sumner. He looks like he's recovered here, but he was the one who gave the vicious speech against slavery and was pummeled with a cane by Preston Brooks later on. So he's now fully recovered roughly 10, 11 years later, and they want to punish the South. They want to make the Confederates pay for what they did. So first, their plan, the Wade Davis bill, is going to require over 50% to take that oath of loyalty. But if that's not severe enough, they want to prevent all Confederates from ever voting or running for office again. And to make sure that these laws are followed, they want to divide the South up into 5 military districts. So you can see here, they want the military to actually send troops to the South to make sure that all of the Reconstruction policies are protected and that African American rights are provided for. So this group of congressmen, they'll be referred to as radical Republicans. They want to really be very strict in how they deal with all the new laws. Now that's the politics of Reconstruction. For African Americans, this is obviously quite personal. So there's going to be several positives for Reconstruction, but there's also going to be several negatives. The positives are the Reconstruction Amendments. So the 13th Amendment will finally abolish slavery, and we're going to examine that in class in greater detail. The 14th Amendment will provide African Americans with citizenship and a whole host of other issues that are dealt with that amendment. And then the 15th Amendment will provide African American males with the right to vote. Now, please keep in mind, women who were largely part of the abolitionist movement felt very slighted, and they were really upset because it does not give them the right to vote for at least another 50 years. There's also going to be a group that Lincoln pioneered called the Freedmen Bureau. And the Freedmen Bureau is going to provide food, clothing, shelter, education, job training, and health care for not only newly freed blacks, but also poor white people who might have needed it as well. Sorry, I can't deal with mistakes. So the Freedmen's Bureau is a major part of Lincoln's legacy. However, Johnson, as I'll explain in a second, did not follow through with that. And you're actually going to see two African Americans elected to the Senate at this time, and their names are Blanche Bruce and Hiram Revels. As you can see here, these are the first two African-American senators elected. They were both from Mississippi, okay? So these are a tremendous list of positives for African-Americans, and as one of the things I'm going to explain to you in class, there are people who think that had Reconstruction continued, that African-American rights would have been achieved far earlier than they were. Now, the negatives are very severe for African-Americans. Southern states are going to pass laws that are called black codes, and these black codes are laws that restricted the rights of African Americans. These are laws that made it very, very difficult. For example, blacks could not own a gun. Blacks could not marry a white person. They could not congregate late at night in large groups. So they're very, very restrictive. In some ways, they even illustrate the evils of slavery. In Tennessee, a terrorist group called the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, is going to form. This is extremely detrimental. And primarily was focused on preventing black people from voting early on. Later on, they will commit violent acts that we'll learn about following Reconstruction. Sharecropping is an economic system that really continued to keep African Americans in a cycle of debt. So what would happen is many of the African Americans who wanted to pursue farming, because that was one of the skills that they had when they were slaves, they don't have the land to be able to do so. So white people were renting the land to them. But in order to pay for that, they had to give them a share of their crops. Is if you are able to make money. So they were never able to sell their crops for a profit, and that's why sharecropping kept them in this cycle of debt. Now I put a question mark here for carpetbaggers and scalawags. Carpetbaggers were Northerners, and scalawags were Southerners. Now initially these were people who were taught as if they were helping African Americans during Reconstruction. But historians have really revised this to now think that many of their methods or their intentions were more selfish and that they were trying to take advantage of African Americans during Reconstruction. And then I had to put Andrew Johnson on a negative side because, well, first of all, many people viewed him as a white supremacist to a certain extent, but he did not support the Freedmen's Bureau. So he cut all funding for that, and I think that really had a tremendously negative impact on specifically the educational opportunities for African Americans. Now, one of the major political conflicts during Reconstruction was the impeachment of President Andrew Johnson. So what happens is the radical Republicans, that's the group that wants to punish the South severely, they pass a law called the Tenure of Office Act. And this law basically says the president is not allowed to remove a member of his cabinet without Congress's approval. Now remember, these cabinet members were appointed by Abraham Lincoln. They're not Andrew Johnson's close advisors. Later on, this act was declared unconstitutional. But Andrew Johnson violated it anyway. He fired his Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton. Now remember, Secretary of War would be the position who was in charge of the 5 military districts, which was in charge of instituting the radical Republican Reconstruction Plan. So that's going to agitate them tremendously. So what happens is the House votes to impeach Johnson. And now we need a trial in the Senate. Here's one of the hottest tickets in the land in 1868 for people to get into the courtroom for this. In order to remove a president, the Founding Fathers established the impeachment process to require 2/3 of the Senate to convict. So I believe we had 27 states at the time. So there were 54 senators. 2/3 of 54 is 36. So you can all see they missed by 1 vote. And what's interesting is that 7 Republicans did not vote for impeachment. They did not support the radical Republicans because they did not believe that the impeachment process should be used for political reasons. Andrew Johnson was not a particularly good person and was not a particularly good president, but they didn't feel as if the litmus test for removal had been met. So now, how does Reconstruction come to an end? It actually ends with an election. Now remember, I'm skipping a lot of things here. There's a president, Ulysses S. Grant, in between this. But in 1876, you have an election between Rutherford B. Hayes the Republican, and Samuel Tilden, the Democrat. Now, on election night, or I guess, within the weeks following that, Hayes had 165 Electoral College votes and Tilden had 184. However, there were 20 votes that were in dispute. Those votes were from Oregon, they were from Louisiana, they were from Florida, and they were from South Carolina. So those 20 votes were really probably largely because of voter intimidation and what they may have done to black voters. It was just not conclusive which candidate won. So what they do is they create a special commission of 15 people to decide, to investigate, who should get these 20 votes. Now, I apologize I didn't write it here, but again, it's 184 to 165 for Tilden. So Hayes needs all 20 of those votes to win by one. Tilden only needs one of them. This special commission of 15 people concluded that all 20 votes should go to Hayes. For those of you who are interested, the committee was a 8-7 split, 8 Republicans, 7 Democrats, and that's how they voted along party lines. So basically, the Democrats could have complained, they could have challenged it in the Supreme Court, but instead, because the Democrats do not like Reconstruction, they made a deal. And they said to the Republicans, we will allow Hayes to be president, but you have to do something for us. Remember those 5 military districts that you instituted? You got to remove them. You got to bring the troops home. So in essence, by bringing the troops home, that ends Reconstruction. By bringing the troops home and conceding the election to Hayes, you've basically ended Reconstruction. So that's I don't know if I kept it under 10 minutes, but that's my brief overview of Reconstruction. It's going to allow us to have some really good discussions about a time period that I really find critical to the modern day American history era. Thank you very much for listening, and I will see you all in class.